The mechanic had always been fascinated by machines that seemed impossible. Even in the middle of the crowded spaceship repair bay, with sparks flying and alarms going off, they felt at peace when working with engines and circuits. The hum of machinery was like a language they understood better than human speech. They had spent years fixing old ships, tuning engines that others had given up on, and finding life in machines that no one else believed could work again. But there was always something bigger calling them, a curiosity that refused to be quiet. And today, that curiosity had pulled them far away from the familiar hum of the repair bay into the dark stretch of space, where few dared to venture. It started with a faint signal, buried beneath the usual cosmic noise. At first, the mechanic wasn't sure it was real. Ancient relics floating through space were often just debris, left over from wars or explorations that had long ended. But this signal was different. It had structure, almost like a heartbeat buried inside the static. That heartbeat led them to a relic ship, a massive structure drifting silently in the darkness. The ship was unlike anything they had ever seen. Its metal hull was scorched and worn, engraved with markings that shimmered faintly under the dim starlight. Some parts looked centuries old, yet others glimmered with an energy that felt alive. The mechanic's eyes widened behind their visor as they studied it. This ship had clearly been abandoned for a long time, yet something about it suggested that it was not completely lifeless. The air around it crackled with energy, subtle but noticeable, making their hair stand on end even through the suit. They knew that stepping aboard could be dangerous. Warnings from colleagues echoed in their mind, voices that spoke of relic ships being cursed or dangerous. But the mechanic didn't listen to those fears. Curiosity outweighed caution. There was something in the design of the ship that called to them, promising knowledge, power, or at least secrets that no one had uncovered in centuries. They docked their small shuttle carefully, the metal of the relic ship groaning as if it remembered the weight of travelers from long ago. As they opened the airlock, the darkness inside the ship seemed almost liquid, swallowing the faint light of their helmet. Every step made the floor echo, hollow and empty, like walking through a tomb. The walls were lined with strange conduits, cables that pulsed faintly, almost like veins. Some of them sparked occasionally, releasing tiny arcs of light that danced across the mechanic's face. The air smelled metallic and old, with an undercurrent of ozone that made them cough. It was clear that no human had been here in a long time, but the ship wasn't dead. Something moved within it. Something watched. Despite the unease, the mechanic felt a thrill. Each corridor they walked seemed to lead them deeper into the ship's secrets. Rusted doors opened with a hiss, revealing rooms filled with machinery that looked alive, panels that blinked as if testing the mechanic's reaction, engines that seemed to breathe. They crouched to inspect one of the consoles, brushing their gloved fingers over strange symbols that glowed faintly. The symbols weren't like any coding language they had seen before, yet there was a rhythm to them, almost musical. The mechanic could feel the machine's presence, almost as if it was alive, sensing their touch, judging their intentions. Then came the first warning. A shadow moved across the corridor ahead, too fast, too fluid for a human. The mechanic froze, holding their breath as the darkness shifted. There was a sound, too, low and guttural, like a growl carried through the metal walls. Their heart thumped loudly, but the mechanic forced themselves to stay calm. They knew panic would be dangerous here. Whoever or whatever was on the ship could sense fear, and fear would make them pray. Slowly, carefully, the mechanic adjusted the helmet light to a dim glow, hoping to see without drawing attention. A flicker of movement revealed a creature unlike anything they had imagined. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, enormous and intelligent. Scales shimmered faintly along its long body, and sharp claws clicked softly against the metal floor. The creature paused, tilting its head as if studying the mechanic. Every instinct screamed to run, but the mechanic remembered why they had come. They needed to understand, to explore, to survive if they wanted to get anything from this ship. Slowly, almost reverently, they stepped forward, making sure to keep their movements calm and deliberate. The creature didn't attack. Instead, it watched, its body coiling slightly. It moved with purpose, not blindly, and the mechanic could sense intelligence behind those eyes. For a moment, the corridor was silent, except for the hum of ancient machinery and the soft echo of their own breathing. Then, without warning, the creature turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the faint impression of heat and movement behind. The mechanic exhaled slowly, feeling both relief and awe. They realized that the ship wasn't just a relic, it was a world of its own, alive with unknown life and strange rules. The mechanic moved deeper into the ship, following corridors that twisted and turned in ways that defied simple architecture. Some doors opened as they approached, others remained stubbornly closed, and some required quick repairs just to pass. They patched circuits with careful precision, rerouted power through broken conduits, and listened to the hum of the ship as if it were music. Every repair felt like a conversation with the ship itself, every spark a small victory. Yet all the while, there was the sense of being watched, of being tested by unseen eyes. Hours passed like minutes. Time felt different here, stretched and compressed by the strange energy of the relic ship. The mechanic discovered rooms filled with tools that seemed impossible, engines that whispered secrets, and panels that could manipulate gravity and energy in ways that no human ship had ever managed. They realized that if they could understand even a fraction of this technology, it would change everything about space travel. But the sense of danger was constant, lurking just beyond their vision. The faint echoes of movement, shadows sliding along walls, and the occasional glint of eyes in the darkness reminded them that they were not alone. Suddenly, a loud clanging noise reverberated through the corridor. The mechanic froze, ears straining. Something massive had moved in the distance, something that could crush them in an instant. They ducked behind a control panel, heart hammering, and tried to think. The creature from before or others, like it, was out there, and it wasn't afraid. The mechanic realized they had to make a choice: retreat to the shuttle and leave the mysteries behind, or press forward, risking everything for the chance to uncover secrets that no one else could reach. Curiosity won. Slowly, deliberately, the mechanic moved forward again, using shadows and walls to stay hidden. Each step was a careful calculation, each movement a negotiation with the unknown. They could feel the ship watching, alive in ways they didn't fully understand, and they could sense the presence of creatures waiting to test them. Yet they felt something else too, a strange connection to this place, a thrill that only came when facing something vast and unknowable. For the first time in years, the mechanic felt completely alive. Every sense alert, every thought focused, every heartbeat in tune with the rhythm of the relic ship. As they reached the center of the ship, a massive chamber opened up before them. It was a place of both wonder and terror, filled with machinery that pulsed like a living heart, with lights that danced along walls covered in alien symbols. In the distance, a shadow moved, larger than any creature they had seen. But this time, the mechanic didn't feel fear, only awe. This was the beginning, the first step into a world that could devour them or elevate them to heights they had never imagined. And even though they didn't know it yet, this first step would change everything. The mechanic paused in the center of the chamber, taking a deep breath through the suit. They could feel energy humming under the floor, running through the walls, and it was almost as if the ship itself was breathing with them. Ahead, shadows twisted and moved, creatures of unknown intent watching their every move. But for the first time, the mechanic felt ready. They were alone in this relic ship, abandoned by their crew, yet alive in a way that only someone who faces the unknown could ever understand. And somewhere deep in the darkness, something watched, waiting, and perhaps even waiting to befriend them. The mechanic had thought the Relic ship was mysterious and alive, but they never expected the betrayal that came next. They had been exploring the twisting corridors for hours, fascinated by the strange machines and the faint pulsing energy that seemed to flow like a heartbeat through the walls. Every step was careful, measured, because the shadows hinted at unseen watchers. But they never imagined that the greatest danger would come not from the creatures in the darkness, but from the humans they had trusted. The shuttle crew had been hesitant from the start. They didn't understand the mechanic's obsession with ancient relics, and every warning from sensors made them uneasy. Still, they had followed at a distance, more out of obligation than curiosity. Now, as the mechanic ventured deeper into the heart of the ship, their patience wore thin. Messages came through the communicator, voices shaky with fear and frustration, urging the mechanic to return. But the mechanic was absorbed, feeling that electric thrill that only came when standing at the edge of discovery. Then, without warning, the voices changed. The crew's tone turned cold, distant, almost clinical. "Return to the shuttle now, or we're leaving without you," one voice said. "You're too far inside. It's not safe. We cannot risk our lives for this," another added. The mechanic's stomach sank. They had always known their curiosity could make others nervous, but this was something else. They realized in that moment that their crew had decided to abandon them. A sense of disbelief mixed with anger. "You can't just leave me here," the mechanic shouted into the communicator, but there was no answer, only static. Panic began to rise, but they fought it down. Panic would make mistakes that could cost them their life. Instead, they took a deep breath, grounding themselves. They were alone now, truly alone. And survival would depend on their wits, their skills, and the understanding that the ship was as much a living challenge as the creatures that lurked within. The corridors of the Relic ship seemed to shift in response to the mechanic's mood. Shadows stretched and twisted, metallic walls hummed softly, and every step echoed ominously. They realized that they could no longer rely on anyone but themselves. Their tools, their experience, and their intuition were all they had. The communicator that once linked them to their crew was useless now, a silent reminder of the betrayal. The mechanic tightened the straps on their suit, checked their toolkit, and pressed on, moving with caution and purpose. It wasn't long before the first real test came. A massive shadow moved across the ceiling, accompanied by a low rumble that shook the floor beneath their feet. The mechanic froze, heart racing. The creatures they had glimpsed before the alien dragons were here, and they were watching. They had thought the dragons were simple predators, but the intelligence in their movements suggested something far more complex. The mechanic understood immediately that these beings were not mindless. They were hunters, yes, but hunters with curiosity, intelligence, and a memory. Hiding behind a series of metallic panels, the mechanic observed the creatures. Their bodies were enormous, covered in shimmering scales that reflected the dim lights of the corridor. Claws clicked softly against the floor as they moved, tails swishing with precision. Each dragon had eyes that glowed faintly, scanning, calculating. The mechanic could feel their gaze, not as a threat alone, but as an examination, as if the creatures were deciding whether the mechanic was worth noticing, worth understanding, or simply worth ignoring. Hours passed in tense silence. The mechanic learned to move like the shadows, to use the walls and corners as shields, to anticipate the dragon's movements. They discovered that the creatures had patterns. They did not wander aimlessly, but followed rhythms, almost like a patrol. By observing these rhythms, the mechanic could navigate the corridors safely, slipping past unseen dangers. Every success bolstered their confidence. Every misstep was a lesson learned. They began to understand that survival here required more than just skill. it required empathy, patience, and the ability to read life forms that were entirely alien. Despite the tension, the mechanic found moments of awe. The Relic ship was not just dangerous, it was beautiful in a strange, haunting way. Machines pulsed with energy that seemed almost organic. Walls glowed with symbols that moved like liquid light, and corridors twisted in impossible ways that defied traditional architecture. It was a living puzzle, a place where every corner held a secret, every shadow a story. For the first time, the mechanic felt completely connected to a world so different from their own. Yet they couldn't forget the danger, the looming presence of the dragons, or the betrayal that had left them alone. The first direct encounter came suddenly. A dragon, larger than any the mechanic had seen before, dropped silently from a darkened shaft into the corridor ahead. Its eyes locked onto the mechanic, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The creature's body was coiled and tense, ready to strike, yet it did not move immediately. The mechanic realized that this moment would decide everything. One wrong move, and they would be devoured. One right move, and perhaps they could survive. The mechanic took a deep breath, speaking softly, almost instinctively, even though they knew the creature would not understand words. Their hands were visible, empty, movements slow and deliberate. They tilted their heads slightly, a gesture they remembered from observing the dragon's body language, signaling curiosity rather than threat. The dragon's head tilted in response. The eyes studied the mechanic for what felt like an eternity. And then, without warning, it stepped back, almost as if testing the mechanic's intentions. That small act of recognition, however, was enough to change everything. The mechanic realized that the dragons were not simply predators. They were intelligent, capable of assessment and decision. They could understand signals, emotions, and intentions, even across species. This was a turning point. The mechanic was no longer just surviving the corridors of the Relic ship. They were beginning a fragile, uneasy dialogue with its most fearsome inhabitants. But survival was still far from guaranteed. The ship itself was treacherous. Floors were unstable, gravity shifted unexpectedly in some sections, and doors would slam or lock without warning. The mechanic had to use every ounce of skill to navigate these hazards. They rewired panels, patched broken conduits, and rerouted power to open locked doors or deactivate dangerous machinery. Each success was hard-won, each step forward a victory against both the environment and the alien creatures. Night, or at least the closest thing to night in this Relic ship, was the hardest. Darkness thickened the shadows, making movement dangerous. The mechanic learned to use sound, vibration, and even the faint heat of the dragon's bodies to sense where it was safe to go. Every misstep could be fatal. They discovered that patience was more powerful than speed. Waiting, observing, and understanding the environment could turn a deadly corridor into a passageway. Over time, the mechanic began to move with the rhythm of the ship, in tune with its hidden energy, guided by both instinct and intellect. Loneliness, however, was the hardest part. Being abandoned by the crew weighed heavily. There were moments when the mechanic felt despair, imagining the faces of those who had left them behind, wondering why curiosity had cost them so much. Yet those moments also sparked resilience. They realized that no one could save them but themselves. Every repair, every careful movement, every observation of the dragon's behavior was a step toward survival, toward mastery of a place that seemed designed to crush anyone who entered unprepared. By the end of what felt like an endless cycle of exploration, observation, and careful survival, the mechanic had changed. Fear had not disappeared, but it had been tempered by skill, understanding, and cautious courage. The Relic ship was no longer just a dangerous place. It was a world that could be navigated, studied, and perhaps even befriended if one had the patience to learn its language. And somewhere in the darkness, The dragons were watching, sometimes from a distance, sometimes closer, always alert, always intelligent. As the mechanic paused in a wide corridor, taking a moment to rest and study the shifting lights of the ancient ship, they realized something important. They were alone, abandoned, and facing creatures that could kill them with a single swipe. Yet they were not helpless. Their knowledge, their intuition, and their courage had allowed them to survive this far. And more than that, they had begun to understand the dragons not as monsters, but as beings capable of intelligence, judgment, and perhaps even alliance. The betrayal had been bitter, leaving a scar that would not heal quickly. But it also had forced the mechanic to become more than they had ever been, more alert, more aware, more alive than ever before. The Relic ship was still full of danger, and the dragons were still watching. Yet the mechanic felt a new sense of purpose. Survival was no longer the only goal. Understanding, connection, and perhaps even friendship with the most alien creatures they had ever encountered was now possible. And in that moment, the mechanic took a deep breath, tightened their grip on their tools, and stepped forward once more, ready to face whatever came next. Alone but not defeated, abandoned but not broken. The mechanic had spent hours moving cautiously through the Relic ship, learning its rhythms, avoiding dangers, and observing the creatures that stalked the corridors. But nothing could have prepared them for the moment when the dragons revealed themselves fully. At first, it was just shadows, a flicker of movement along the walls, the faint shimmer of scales reflecting the pale light of the ship's corridors. But then came a sound that made every nerve in the mechanic's body tighten, a low, resonating growl that vibrated through the metal floor and walls. The growl was followed by a movement, massive and fluid, gliding through the corridor like liquid metal. The mechanic froze, pressing against the cold walls, holding their breath as the dragon's eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, locked onto them. The creature was enormous, its wings folded tightly against its back, claws clicking softly against the floor. Its head tilted slightly, studying the mechanic with an intelligence that was both frightening and fascinating. This was no mindless predator. Every line of its body, every calculated movement, spoke of awareness, judgment, and curiosity. The mechanic felt a wave of fear, the kind that grips your chest and makes it hard to breathe. But alongside the fear was something else, an almost irresistible pull to understand. They had faced dangerous machines before, repaired engines that should have been beyond saving, and navigated ships in the worst possible conditions. But nothing had ever felt like this, a living, thinking, observing presence that could end their life in a heartbeat. And yet, somehow, it felt like the dragon wanted more than just to kill. For the first time, the mechanic realized the dragons were not purely aggressive. They were testing, assessing. Every movement the mechanic made, every gesture, was being watched and interpreted. The creature crouched slightly, tail swishing, eyes narrowing and widening, as if considering an unspoken question. Slowly, carefully, the mechanic moved one hand out in front, open, showing nothing but calm intent. It was a small gesture, almost instinctive, but it seemed to resonate. The dragon tilted its head again, studying the mechanic's hand. Then, almost imperceptibly, it stepped back. The mechanic exhaled, silently, trying to control the rapid beat of their heart. One encounter like this could have ended in death. But instead, it had ended in hesitation. They realized that the dragons could be reasoned with, or at least communicated with, in a way. The challenge now was figuring out how. They could not speak the dragon's language, but perhaps there were other ways. Gestures, movements, vibrations, the subtle use of light or sound. The mechanic began to experiment cautiously, extending a hand, then tapping lightly on the metal floor, creating vibrations that the dragon seemed to notice. It was not immediate, and progress was slow. The dragons did not respond with words, of course, but their reactions were telling. A tilt of the head, a shift in body posture, the flick of a tail, these small signs were the closest thing the mechanic had to feedback. And through patient observation, patterns began to emerge. The dragons moved with rhythm, reacted to certain sounds and vibrations, and seemed capable of memory. They were learning as quickly as the mechanic was, adjusting to the mechanic's presence and actions. Days, or at least what felt like days inside the ship, passed in this tense dance. The mechanic moved carefully through the corridors, observing and experimenting, slowly building an understanding of the dragon's behavior. They discovered that the creatures were curious, often approaching areas the mechanic had just fixed, touching panels or machinery with claws or snouts. At first, these interactions were dangerous. The dragons were strong, and a careless swipe could destroy delicate circuits or even injure the mechanic. But over time, a rhythm emerged, a silent negotiation, where the mechanic and the dragons learned to coexist. That the first real breakthrough came unexpectedly. The mechanic had been repairing a section of the ship's energy conduits when a dragon, curious, leaned close to inspect the glowing machinery. A spark jumped from the conduit, striking the creature. It yelped and stumbled, clearly in pain. Without thinking, the mechanic rushed forward, using their tools to stabilize the conduit, rerouting energy and preventing further damage. They spoke softly, trying to calm the creature even though it could not understand words. The dragon froze, its eyes fixed on the mechanic, and then, in a movement almost too quick to see, it stepped back, but did not flee or attack. In that instant, something shifted. The dragon had expected harm, but instead had received help. The mechanic realized that the first step toward real communication might not be words or gestures. It might be trust, built through actions that showed care rather than threat. From that moment, the dynamic changed. The dragons still tested the mechanic, still observed and assessed. But now there was a new element, caution mixed with curiosity. Suspicion mingled with recognition. The mechanic began to experiment more boldly. They left small repairs in place, adjusting lights and panels in ways that created patterns the dragons could follow. They tapped on walls and floors in rhythms, noticing how the dragons responded to certain sequences. Over time, the creatures seemed to anticipate the mechanic's movements, sometimes moving out of the way, sometimes following with apparent interest. It was a delicate, silent conversation, a dance of intelligence and observation. Living in this environment was not easy. The Relic ship was unpredictable and hazardous. Floors shifted without warning, gravity fields fluctuated, and ancient machinery sometimes activated spontaneously. The mechanic had to remain alert at all times, balancing their efforts to understand the dragons with the practical need to survive. Every corridor was a challenge, every room a puzzle, and every encounter with the dragons a test of patience and ingenuity. There were moments of terror. Shadows would flare across the walls. Massive claws would scratch metal, and the mechanic would freeze in place, heart hammering, waiting for the dragon's judgment. But there were also moments of wonder. The dragons moved with grace and power that was mesmerizing, their scales shimmering like living metal, their eyes reflecting intelligence beyond anything the mechanic had imagined. Slowly, awe replaced some of the fear, and the mechanic began to see the dragons not as monsters, but as beings with purpose, thought, and perhaps even feelings. Over time, the mechanic began to learn patterns. Certain corridors were preferred hunting grounds, while others seemed sacred, untouched even by the dragons. Certain sounds or vibrations could attract attention, while others could signal safety. The mechanic adapted, using these observations to navigate the ship more confidently. They repaired machinery with care, leaving signals for the dragons to follow, learning how to coexist rather than simply avoid them. Each small success reinforced the fragile trust that was slowly growing between human and dragon. The breakthrough came during a particularly tense encounter. One of the larger dragons cornered the mechanic in a narrow corridor. Its eyes glowed, body coiled, wings partially unfurled. Every instinct screamed to flee, but escape was impossible. The mechanic froze, trying to appear calm, slowly lowering their tools and extending both hands in a non-threatening manner. The dragon approached, sniffing and studying, claws clicking softly. For a heartbeat, it seemed poised to strike, but then it paused, stepping back slightly and lowering its head. The mechanic understood. This was a test, and they had passed. From that moment, communication deepened. The dragons began to acknowledge the mechanic's presence in ways that were unmistakable. They would step aside to allow passage, observe repairs with apparent curiosity, and even interact with the machinery in ways that mirrored the mechanic's actions. A pattern of cooperation began to emerge, fragile and tentative, but unmistakable. The mechanic realized that survival was no longer just about avoiding death. It was about learning, adapting, and forming an alliance of sorts. However cautious it might be by the end of this phase, the mechanic was no longer simply hiding or running. They were exploring, experimenting, and interacting. They had learned to read the dragon's signals, to anticipate their movements, and to respond in ways that minimized danger while maximizing understanding. Every corridor became a classroom, every encounter a lesson, and every repair a conversation. The mechanic was beginning to understand that the dragons were not enemies in the traditional sense. They were intelligent, capable of judgment, and open to connection if approached with respect and care. And as they paused in the center of the relic ship, looking at the faint glow of machinery and the shadows of the dragons moving silently around them, the mechanic felt a strange sense of hope. They were alone, abandoned by their crew, facing creatures that could have ended them without hesitation. Yet here they were, learning, surviving, and beginning to communicate in a way that transcended species. It was terrifying, exhausting, and exhilarating all at once. And somewhere deep in the darkness, the dragons watched, not with immediate aggression, but with awareness, curiosity, and perhaps the first glimmer of trust. The mechanic knew that the journey was only beginning. Survival had required courage and intelligence, but understanding and alliance would require more: patience, empathy, and the willingness to see the dragons not as monsters, but as partners in navigating this ancient living relic. The first step had been taken, and while the path ahead was uncertain, the mechanic had spent countless hours navigating the relic ship, avoiding danger and observing the dragons. They had learned to read the creatures' movements, anticipate their reactions, and slowly earn a fragile trust. But nothing could have prepared them for what happened next. The moment that would change everything it began with a section of the ship they had avoided for days. The corridor was narrower than most, with pipes and conduits running along the walls, some sparking and others completely silent. The mechanic had come to understand that these sections were especially dangerous, not only because of the unstable machinery, but because the dragons were more active here, moving with purpose, testing the boundaries of this part of their world. Today, however, something else was waiting. A low rumble echoed through the corridor, followed by the metallic screech of a heavy panel shifting. The mechanic froze, heart racing, as a dragon emerged from the shadows. This one was larger than any they had seen before, scales glinting like molten metal under the dim light, eyes glowing with intelligence and awareness. It stepped forward, claws clicking against the floor, and then paused. The mechanic could see it was wounded. One of its legs was bent at an unnatural angle, and a faint trail of glowing ichor dripped from a small cut. Fear gripped the mechanic at first. This was a creature far beyond the capacity of human strength to fight or control. Any wrong move could provoke it into attacking. Yet beneath the fear was something stronger, a deep instinct to act. The dragon was vulnerable, injured, and alone. If the mechanic could help, perhaps it would see them not as a threat, but as an ally. Without hesitation, they set down their tools and approached slowly, keeping their movements deliberate and calm. The dragon watched them with sharp, calculating eyes. Its tail flicked with tension, and wings twitched as though ready to defend itself at a moment's notice. The mechanic knew that one wrong gesture could trigger aggression, so they spoke softly, not expecting comprehension, but hoping the tone might convey reassurance. Slowly, they knelt and examined the wound, improvising with tools and materials they carried. Sparks flew as they rerouted energy conduits to stabilize the dragon's limb and applied makeshift supports to prevent further damage. Every movement was careful, precise, and intentional. For what felt like hours, they worked in tense silence, the dragon remaining still, eyes fixed on the mechanic. Occasionally, it shifted slightly, a subtle warning, but it did not attack. The mechanic could feel the creature's awareness, its intelligence, its decision-making. Here was a being capable of judging intentions, and for the first time, the mechanic sensed that their actions were being understood. When the improvised splint was finally in place, the dragon tested it by shifting its weight. There was a tense pause, and then, almost imperceptibly, it relaxed. It had survived the encounter without harm, and in that moment, the mechanic realized a truth that had eluded them until now. The dragons were capable of trust. From that moment, the balance between them began to shift. The mechanic could see it in the way the dragons moved, less aggressive, more observant, occasionally waiting as the mechanic passed through corridors or worked on machinery. The dragons still tested the mechanic's limits, but there was now a sense of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that this human was different from those who had come before. The mechanic began to experiment more deliberately, using subtle gestures, vibrations, and even lights to communicate intent, to signal non-aggression. To establish understanding, the turning point came during an exploration of a control room, filled with panels and machines that hummed with faint energy. The mechanic was attempting to repair a malfunctioning console when a smaller dragon appeared, circling warily above. Without thinking, the mechanic reached out and touched the console in a specific sequence, activating a hidden repair mechanism. The dragon froze mid-air, its glowing eyes locking onto the human's hands. Then, in a sudden, astonishing motion, it landed near the mechanic, nudging the console gently with its snout. This small act of interaction changed everything. The mechanic understood that the dragons were beginning to interpret their actions, to see the human as more than a threat. They were responding, adapting, and even initiating behavior that could be considered cooperative. Over the next few hours, the mechanic experimented with patterns of movement, tapping out rhythms on the metal floor, and using lights to signal areas that were safe or required attention. Each successful response from a dragon reinforced the fragile connection, and the mechanic realized that survival was no longer a solo struggle. It could become a partnership. Living alongside the dragons was still dangerous. Their immense size, strength, and unpredictability meant that even small mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. The mechanic learned to anticipate not only the dragon's movements, but also their own reactions to the shifting environment of the relic ship. They became attuned to subtle cues, a twitch of a tail, a flare of nostrils, the flicker of eyes in the shadows. These signs became a language of their own, a way to navigate danger while building understanding. The mechanic also began to observe the dragons' behaviors more closely. They saw how the creatures interacted with each other, how they respected certain spaces within the ship, and how they responded to external threats. The dragons were intelligent, not merely instinct-driven. They had rules, hierarchy, and even curiosity that mirrored the human's own. Slowly, the mechanic began to recognize patterns and leverage them to move safely through the ship. It was a delicate, balanced cooperation without complacency, but it was the first time the mechanic felt that they were not completely alone in the vast alien environment. One particularly harrowing moment tested this fragile alliance. A structural failure in one corridor caused a cascade of sparks and debris. The mechanic had no time to react, and the falling metal threatened to trap them. But a dragon, sensing the danger, leapt forward, using its massive body to shield the mechanic while nudging debris aside. The mechanic scrambled free, heart pounding, and in that instant, the realization hit. This creature had chosen to act not out of instinct, but out of recognition and trust. Survival was no longer merely about skill, it was about collaboration. From that day forward, the mechanic's interactions with the dragons changed fundamentally. They learned to anticipate each other, to respect boundaries, and to understand the creature's responses as a guide. Repairs and exploration became exercises in cooperation. When a machine malfunctioned, the dragons would often assist in ways that were subtle but effective, nudging components into place, blocking hazards, or simply observing so the mechanic could work without interference. Every small success built trust, and every moment of danger reinforced the importance of understanding and empathy. The mechanic also discovered that the dragons had knowledge of the relic ship that was invaluable. Certain areas had been inaccessible or incomprehensible until the dragons indicated safe passages or activated hidden mechanisms with their touch and strength. This partnership allowed the mechanic to unlock sections of the ship that had been mysteries for centuries. Together, human and dragon began to unravel the secrets of the ancient vessel, each contributing unique skills, intellect, dexterity, and patience from the mechanic, and strength, intuition, and instinct from the dragons. Amidst all the danger and discovery, the mechanic began to experience a deep, almost emotional connection with these creatures. They were terrifying and beautiful, alien and intelligent, yet capable of understanding and cooperation. The initial fear that had gripped the mechanic when they first encountered the dragons had transformed into respect, awe, and cautious friendship. In the vast, silent corridors of the relic ship, the mechanic realized that alliances could be forged in the unlikeliest of circumstances, and that survival was not merely about avoiding death, it was about building trust, learning, and growing in the face of the unknown. By the time the mechanic paused to rest in a wide, softly lit chamber, they reflected on how far they had come. Hours or days of cautious interaction, observation, and ingenuity had led to a fragile but meaningful alliance. The dragons no longer approached solely with suspicion or aggression. They watched, tested, and sometimes assisted, forming a rhythm of interaction that was subtle but unmistakable. The mechanic knew that the path ahead would still be fraught with danger, but they also understood that they were no longer alone. There was partnership here, fragile but real, and it was a bond built on intelligence, respect, and shared purpose. In that quiet moment, the mechanic felt a spark of hope. They had been abandoned, left to face unknown horrors alone, yet they had found allies in the most unexpected form. The dragons, once terrifying predators, were now participants in a delicate relationship, a tentative alliance that could grow stronger with patience, understanding, and trust. And somewhere deep within the labyrinth of the relic ship, both human and dragons were beginning to recognize something profound. Survival was no longer a solitary struggle, but a shared journey. The mechanic tightened their grip on their tools, glanced at the softly glowing corridors, and stepped forward. Every sound, every shadow, every movement would be observed, understood, and responded to. They were no longer just surviving, they were communicating, cooperating, and begin. By now, the mechanic and the dragons had developed a fragile but steady rhythm of cooperation. What had started as fear and survival had slowly transformed into mutual understanding. The mechanic had learned to anticipate the dragon's movements, to recognize the subtle signals that indicated curiosity, warning, or interest. In return, the dragons seemed to sense that the mechanic meant no harm, and they allowed the human to work alongside them, sometimes even assisting in ways that were subtle but invaluable. The Relic ship, once a maze of danger and isolation, was beginning to feel navigable, a world that could be explored and understood if one respected its rules and its inhabitants. The exploration began with small steps. The mechanic carefully moved through corridors, patching broken circuits, repairing machinery, and leaving signals or patterns for the dragons to follow. The dragons, in turn, would often linger nearby, their massive forms blending with the shadows, occasionally nudging broken panels back into place or gently guiding objects that the mechanic could not reach alone. There were no words exchanged, of course, but over time, a pattern emerged. The dragons and the mechanic had learned to communicate through action, gesture, and observation. Every successful collaboration reinforced the trust between them. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when the mechanic discovered a room filled with consoles and panels that seemed to control a section of the ship's power grid. The machinery was ancient, delicate, and partially damaged from years of neglect. Alone, the mechanic might have struggled for days to get it working again. But with the dragon's assistance, tasks that would have been impossible became manageable. A dragon used its tail to hold a heavy conduit in place, while the mechanic tightened loose bolts. Another dragon nudged a stuck lever into position. It was a silent symphony of cooperation, each participant contributing their unique strengths to solve a complex problem out as the day wore on. The mechanic realized that the ship was full of secrets, many of which had remained untouched for centuries. Rooms that had seemed locked or inaccessible began to open when the dragons and the mechanic worked together. Some corridors required the dragon's strength to lift heavy panels or move machinery blocking the path. Others demanded the mechanic's ingenuity to reroute energy, repair circuits, or decipher strange alien symbols. Together, they were able to explore areas that had been completely unreachable before. Every new section revealed more about the ship's history and its purpose, and the mechanic felt the thrill of discovery surging through them. Despite the progress, danger was never far away. The Relic ship had been abandoned for centuries, and many of its systems were unstable. Gravity fields fluctuated without warning, energy conduits sparked unpredictably, and some sections were trapped with automated defenses that had not been deactivated. The mechanic had to remain constantly alert, planning movements carefully and coordinating actions with the dragons. The dragons, too, were alert, often sensing hazards before the mechanic could, using instincts that were honed over generations. Their cooperation was not just beneficial, it was essential for survival. The alliance between human and dragons also had unexpected consequences. The mechanic noticed changes in the dragons' behavior. They were more willing to approach areas that had once been off limits, more attentive to the mechanic's actions, and sometimes initiated interactions that seemed almost playful. A dragon might tap a panel in a sequence that complemented the mechanic's repairs or nudge a heavy object toward them without instruction. It was as though the dragons were beginning to understand not only what the mechanic was doing, but why it mattered. The bond, though silent, was growing stronger with every shared task and every challenge overcome together. As they explored deeper, the mechanic discovered chambers filled with strange, advanced technology. Some devices seemed to manipulate gravity, bending it in ways that made movement easier or harder depending on the mechanism. Others emitted soft, pulsating lights, resonating in frequencies that caused machinery or even the dragons to react. The mechanic could not understand all of it immediately, but the dragons seemed familiar with the functions, guiding the human subtly. Sometimes a dragon would nudge a lever, press a button with a claw, or block a pathway. and the mechanic would follow the cues, uncovering hidden functions or opening access to previously unreachable areas. Every day brought new lessons, not just about the ship, but about cooperation. The mechanic learned to anticipate the dragon's reactions to different stimuli, to respect their space while also relying on their abilities. The dragons, in turn, learned to read the human's intentions, recognizing gestures and patterns of behavior that signaled safety, need, or direction. Together, they had created a new unspoken language, a partnership that allowed them to achieve feats that neither could manage alone. It was a fragile balance, but it worked. One particularly intense challenge tested their alliance. A section of the ship's ceiling, weakened over centuries, began to collapse as the mechanic worked on a vital panel. Debris started falling, and the mechanic had no time to escape on their own. Instinctively, a dragon leapt forward, using its massive body to shield the mechanic, holding up pieces of falling metal with incredible strength while the humans scrambled to safety. Another dragon moved to stabilize a loose conduit, ensuring that the machinery below would not spark and cause further damage. The mechanic realized in that moment that trust had become action. The dragons had chosen to protect them, not out of instinct alone, but because of the bond they had formed. This experience reinforced the mechanic's understanding of what it meant to be allies. Survival was no longer a solo endeavor, nor was it merely about coexistence. It was about collaboration, understanding, and learning to act together in a world that was inherently dangerous and unpredictable. The mechanic had come to respect the dragons not as monsters, but as intelligent, powerful beings with their own instincts, awareness, and loyalty. In turn, the dragons seemed to respect the mechanic's intelligence, creativity, and courage. As the mechanic explored more of the ship, they discovered a large chamber that appeared to be a control hub for multiple sections of the vessel. The panels were complex, with layers of circuitry, lights, and switches that no human could fully understand alone. With the dragon's assistance, the mechanic began to unravel the systems, learning how energy flowed through the ship, how doors and conduits were controlled, and how the ancient machinery responded to different inputs. The dragons guided and assisted, nudging levers, holding panels steady, and even signaling areas that required caution. Each successful interaction deepened the bond and made the human feel less alone in the vast, alien environment. Over time, the mechanic began to notice subtle changes in themselves as well. The fear that had gripped them when first abandoned had diminished, replaced by a calm confidence rooted in skill, observation, and trust. They moved through the ship with purpose, aware of hazards, but no longer paralyzed by them. They had learned patience, the value of careful observation, and the importance of communication, even silent communication. And in this process, the dragons had become more than survival partners. They were companions, allies who shared the journey, and helped unlock secrets that had remained hidden for centuries. One evening, though, time on the Relic ship was difficult to measure. The mechanic paused in a chamber filled with softly glowing machinery. A dragon hovered nearby, watching, while another nudged a small panel that had been stuck for decades, helping it slide into place. The mechanic felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Alone, this chamber would have been nearly impossible to access or repair. Together, human and dragons had overcome obstacles, navigated dangers, and begun to understand the ship's purpose and structure. It was more than survival. It was discovery, collaboration, and growth. As they continued to explore, the mechanic realized something profound. This alliance, born out of necessity and danger, had grown into something extraordinary. The dragons were no longer just creatures to avoid or fear. They were intelligent, capable, and willing participants in a shared struggle. Together, they had created a rhythm, a language, and a partnership that allowed them to survive, thrive, and uncover secrets that had been hidden for centuries. It was an unlikely bond, forged in fear, trust, and mutual respect. And it was now their greatest strength. The mechanic tightened their grip on their tools, glanced at the dragons moving silently through the corridors, and felt a surge of determination. The relic ship was still full of danger, still full of mysteries waiting to be unraveled, but they were no longer alone. The dragons were not just allies, they were partners, companions in a journey that neither could complete alone. Together, they had the strength, intelligence, and trust to face whatever lay ahead, whether it was hidden machinery, unstable corridors, or the secrets of a ship that had waited centuries for someone to understand it. And as the mechanic stepped forward into the glowing corridor, following a dragon who had taken the lead, they knew one thing with certainty. Survival was no longer about fear or avoidance. It was about collaboration, understanding, and the extraordinary power of working together. The relic ship had become a place of wonder and danger, a world that demanded respect, patience, and courage, and the mechanic had come a long way since first stepping onto the relic ship. They had been abandoned, faced unimaginable dangers, and learned to survive alongside creatures that could have easily ended their life in an instant. But now, after days or perhaps weeks of navigating the labyrinthine corridors, repairing ancient machinery, and learning to communicate with the dragons, the mechanic faced the final challenge: escaping the relic ship alive. The journey ahead was uncertain, dangerous, and demanded every ounce of skill, intelligence, and trust they had developed. The first step was understanding the ship's final secret. A massive chamber lay at the center of the vessel, glowing faintly with energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. Panels and conduits twisted across the walls, some sparking, some humming with power, and some covered in alien symbols that seemed to move subtly, almost as if alive. The mechanic had repaired and navigated nearly every section of the ship, but this central chamber was different. It seemed alive in a way no other part had, reacting to the presence of the dragons and the mechanic alike. Every movement here would be critical, because even a small mistake could trigger catastrophic energy surges or collapse unstable structures. The dragons hovered near the entrance, massive shadows against the glowing walls, wings folded but alert. They had become more than companions. They were partners in the humans' mission. The mechanic took a deep breath and stepped forward, moving carefully toward the central console. Each footstep echoed softly, amplified by the hollow metallic structure of the chamber. The dragons followed, scanning the surroundings, occasionally nudging debris or activating mechanisms with their claws and snouts to assist the mechanic's progress. The rhythm between them was seamless now, almost instinctual, as if each had learned the other's movements by heart. At the console, the mechanic began to decipher the alien mechanisms, trying to understand how to bring the ship to life long enough for an escape. Panels glowed, responding to touch, but some areas were dangerous, sending sparks or pulses of energy if handled incorrectly. The mechanic's hands moved quickly, carefully, rerouting circuits, stabilizing conduits, and aligning components that had not been touched in centuries. A dragon nudged a heavy lever into position, while another held a panel steady with its massive body. It was a delicate dance, combining human intelligence and precision with the dragon's strength and intuition. Suddenly, a low rumble shook the chamber. Sections of the floor trembled, as if the ship itself were awakening, reacting to the manipulations. The mechanic froze, heart pounding, eyes darting across the panels for clues. The dragons tensed immediately, wings flicking and tails swishing. Sparks flew from broken conduits, and a section of the ceiling began to creak ominously. The situation was precarious. One wrong move could collapse the chamber or trigger an energy overload. But the mechanic focused, drawing on all the knowledge and experience gained over the past days. Step by step, the console began to respond. Light stabilized, energy flowed steadily through the conduits, and the low rumble shifted into a steady hum. The dragons relaxed slightly, sensing the change. The mechanic's chest tightened with relief and anticipation. This was the moment of truth. If the central chamber could be fully activated, it might allow access to the ship's exit, a way to return to the shuttle that had once abandoned them. But reaching it would not be simple. The corridors leading out were unstable, and the ship seemed to resist movement. As if testing whether the mechanic and the dragons were worthy of leaving, they moved forward carefully, the dragons flanking and guiding the mechanic. Each step required vigilance. Loose panels, shifting floors, and sparking conduits threatened at every turn. But the dragon's awareness and strength made the path navigable. When a panel blocked the corridor, a dragon used its tail to lift it. When a floor section threatened to collapse, another dragon stabilized it with its claws while the mechanic crossed. Every moment was a test of coordination and trust, and every success reinforced the bond that had formed between human and dragon's dot as they neared the ship's exit. The Relic vessel resisted more aggressively. Energy surged through panels, sparks flew from malfunctioning circuits, and shadows shifted in ways that made the corridor feel alive. The mechanic could feel the tension building, the danger growing with every step. Yet, instead of panic, they drew strength from the dragon's presence. These creatures, once terrifying predators, had become guardians, guides, and allies. Together, they navigated traps, avoided hazards, and pushed forward with determination. Finally, they reached the last obstacle, a massive airlock leading to the shuttle docking area. The airlock was partially fused shut from centuries of neglect and damage, and it required precise manipulation to open. Alone, the mechanic could never have done it. But with the dragon's help, progress was possible. One dragon pressed its massive body against the airlock, holding it steady while the mechanic worked on the locking mechanisms. Another nudged a heavy panel into alignment, allowing the locks to disengage. The combination of strength, precision, and trust created a synergy that made the impossible achievable dot with a hiss of escaping air and the grinding of metal. The airlock finally opened. Light from the docking bay spilled into the corridor, illuminating the mechanic's face and reflecting off the dragon's scales. Relief surged through the human's body, but there was no time to linger. The ship, still unstable and unpredictable, could collapse or react violently at any moment. They had to move quickly, yet cautiously. The mechanic stepped forward, dragons following closely, moving as one unit toward the shuttle that had once abandoned them. Reaching the shuttle, the mechanic activated the docking sequence. Panels lit up, engines hummed, and the ship responded, ready for departure. The dragons hovered nearby, observing, and then, in an astonishing display of understanding, they moved with the shuttle, guiding and stabilizing it as the mechanic prepared for launch. It was a moment that combined technology, intelligence, and trust in a way the mechanic had never imagined possible. Together, human and dragons had taken control of a relic vessel that had resisted humans for centuries. As the shuttle detached and began moving away from the relic ship, the mechanic looked back at the massive, ancient structure. It was still humming, alive in its own mysterious way, but it no longer held the same immediate threat. The dragons circled the ship once, a silent gesture of acknowledgement, and then returned to hover beside the shuttle. The mechanic understood that the bond they had formed was more than survival. It was partnership. These creatures, once feared, had become allies, intelligent, capable, and trustworthy companions. The journey back to familiar space was tense but steady. The dragons remained vigilant, sensing hazards in ways the mechanic could not, guiding the shuttle through treacherous regions of debris and unstable gravitational fields. The mechanic monitored the controls, repairing minor malfunctions and keeping the engine stable. Together, They moved with precision and coordination, a team forged through adversity, danger, and mutual respect. During the trip, the mechanic reflected on everything that had happened. They had been abandoned, left to face unimaginable dangers alone. They had encountered creatures that could have easily ended their life. And yet, through patience, intelligence, and courage, they had transformed fear into trust and danger into alliance. The Relic ship had been both a challenge and a teacher, revealing the importance of observation, understanding, and collaboration. And the dragons, once terrifying predators, had become partners and friends in a journey that was now almost complete. As familiar stars came into view, signaling the edge of the unknown territory, the mechanic felt a profound sense of accomplishment. They had survived against impossible odds, learned to communicate with creatures beyond comprehension, and unlocked secrets that had been hidden for centuries. The alliance with the dragons was no longer fragile. It was real, tested, and proven through fire, danger, and shared effort. They were no longer alone. Finally, the shuttle stabilized in safe orbit. The mechanic stepped back from the controls, allowing the dragons to settle nearby. There was no need for words. The trust between them was understood in every gesture, every glance, and every movement. The mechanic realized that the story of survival, discovery, and alliance had reached its climax. What had begun as abandonment and terror had become a journey of courage, intelligence, and unexpected friendship. Looking out at the Relic ship one last time, the mechanic felt a mixture of awe and gratitude. The dragons hovered beside them, silent and powerful, a reminder that trust and cooperation could bridge even the vastest differences. Together, they had turned a story of fear and abandonment into one of triumph and connection. And though the journey had been perilous and unpredictable, the lessons were clear. Understanding, patience, and respect could transform even the deadliest environment into a place of growth. Partnership, an extraordinary possibility. With a deep breath, the mechanic prepared to navigate the shuttle back to familiar space, dragons at their side, and a sense of accomplishment burning brighter than any fear that had come before. They had survived. They had discovered. They had formed an alliance that would change everything. And as the stars stretched endlessly ahead, the mechanic knew one undeniable truth.